John tightened his grip on the steering wheel as the family's old SUV creaked over the uneven asphalt. The sun had long dipped below the horizon, leaving only a faint glow behind the thick line of trees that flanked the empty highway. John's wife, Margaret, squinted out the window, her hand pressed over her brow despite the dim light, trying to make sense of the road ahead. Their 2 children, Emma and Tommy, were nestled in the back seat, whispering occasionally to each other about shadows flickering along the roadside. The trip had been long and uneventful until they'd passed a cluster of abandoned gas stations and roadside diners that had once been lively. Now, everything seemed swallowed by the darkness. That's when John noticed it alone, dilapidated motel sitting just off the highway. Its paint was peeling, windows grimy and cracked, and a single, flickering bulb over the entrance cast a sickly yellow light onto the gravel parking lot. The letters of the motel's sign were barely legible, some missing entirely, leaving only an ominous outline of what it once had been. "Maybe we should stop for the night," John said, trying to keep his voice casual, though a shiver ran down his spine. Margaret hesitated, her eyes narrowing as she studied the building. "I don't know. It looks weird. Kind of off," she said. But even as she spoke, she knew they had little choice. Driving any farther would mean risking exhaustion, and the children were already growing restless. They pulled into the gravel lot, the tires crunching loudly in the silence. The closer they got, the more John noticed that the place was completely deserted. There wasn't even the faint sound of a TV or a radio. The wind carried a strange scent, a mixture of damp wood, old carpet, and something faintly metallic that made his stomach churn. The front desk was empty, but a small ledger sat atop the counter, yellowed with age. A heavy iron key hung from a nail on the wall behind it, the number 7 inches crudely etched into its rusted surface. John reached for it, his fingers brushing the cold metal, and for a moment, he felt a strange tremor, as though the key itself were alive. The hallway to room 7 smelled of decay and dust. Wallpaper had peeled in long strips, and the carpet was threadbare, exposing the warped floorboards beneath. As they settled in, the children's unease grew. Emma, older and more sensitive to oddities, pressed close to Margaret. "Mom, the trees outside, they're moving," she whispered. Margaret chuckled softly, brushing it off as exhaustion. "It's just the wind, sweetie. You're imagining things." But Emma's eyes didn't leave the window, wide with fear. The shadows outside didn't flicker like normal, they twisted, stretched, and seemed to inch closer toward the room with every gust of wind. Night deepened. The motel was eerily quiet, but the quiet didn't feel natural. Every so often, there was a faint sound, the whisper of footsteps that didn't match anyone in the room, a low creak of the floorboards somewhere in the distance. Then came a soft, almost imperceptible scratching on the door, as if something or someone was testing the boundary between inside and outside. Tommy clutched his stuffed bear tightly, his small hands trembling. "Dad, someone's out there," he murmured. John tried to calm him. "It's nothing, buddy. Probably just the old building settling. Hear it? Old houses make noises." But even as he spoke, the scratching continued, more insistent, now accompanied by a soft, dragging sound along the hallway outside. Margaret's face went pale. "John, I think we should leave," she said, her voice tight with tension. But the children were exhausted, and leaving in the dead of night along this desolate highway seemed equally risky. Then, the air in the room grew colder, not just chilly, but bone deep. The kind of cold that creeps under your skin and settles in your chest. The shadows inside the room seemed to thicken, pooling in the corners and stretching toward them. Emma's voice trembled. "Mom, there's something in the corner." Margaret turned, heart hammering, but saw only darkness, the kind that seemed denser than it should be. Tommy whimpered, "I can see it too. It's moving." And then, unmistakable, a shadow coalesced into a vaguely human shape, hunched and indistinct, almost like smoke had taken form. It slid silently along the wall, its edges blurred, yet every movement precise. The children shrieked, clutching their parents desperately. John grabbed a flashlight from his bag, flicking it on, but the beam barely penetrated the darkness. When it did, the shadow seemed to shrink away from the light, almost playful in its malevolence. It vanished for a moment, leaving the room feeling impossibly larger and colder than before. A loud thump echoed through the room, and the door rattled violently, as though someone or something was pushing against it from the outside. The family huddled together, hearts pounding. Every instinct screamed at them to run, but the dark, heavy air made it difficult even to breathe. Then came the whispers. At first, they were faint, almost like the wind through the cracks. But soon, they became words, unintelligible yet clearly directed at them, crawling along the edges of their minds, pressing on their thoughts with a suffocating weight. John felt a surge of panic and grabbed Margaret's hand. "We have to get out of here," he shouted. But when he turned toward the door, the hallway outside seemed to stretch impossibly, longer and darker than it had been when they'd arrived. The walls appeared to breathe, pulsing slightly as though alive. The key in his pocket grew warm, almost hot, and he felt a strange pressure, as if the room itself were aware of their fear. Feeding off it, Emma started crying hysterically. "It's going to get us. It's going to get us," she screamed. Tommy echoed her cries, and the shadows in the room seemed to flicker in response, stretching, writhing, leaning closer. John tried to reason with them, but reason felt useless in the suffocating dark. Then, a low, guttural sound came from the corner, like something exhaling after centuries of being trapped. The shadow solidified slightly, a vague figure with hollow eyes and a cruel, twisted smile that seemed to exist without a face. Margaret screamed, pulling the children toward the bed, but the figure began to advance slowly, deliberately, as if savoring their terror. John tried to block it with the flashlight, but the beam seemed to bend around the shape, refusing to illuminate it properly. The temperature dropped further, frost forming on the edges of the window panes. Their breaths came out in visible puffs. John's hands shook as he fumbled for the key, hoping against hope that it held some power. Some protection. Then, abruptly, silence. The shadow stopped, hovering just beyond reach, its empty eyes locked on them. The children shivered violently, whispering prayers they didn't fully understand. John knew that leaving the room now would be a gamble. Every step into the dark hallway could mean disaster, and yet staying seemed equally dangerous, trapped as they were in a room that had somehow become a cage for their fear. The family pressed close together, waiting for what would come next, knowing instinctively that whatever had settled in that motel, that darkness, was patient. It would not leave without consuming something from them. Not their bodies, perhaps, but certainly their minds, their sense of safety, their very sanity. And as the clock crept toward midnight, the shadows outside the window shifted again, and the faint glow of the flickering bulb cast twisted shapes on the wall that seemed to mock them, whispering promises of a night that had only just begun. Morning light spilled weakly across the horizon, painting the edges of the empty highway in pale gold. The family had somehow made it to the outskirts of a small town, its modest houses and shuttered storefronts a stark contrast to the desolate stretch of road and the haunted motel they had left behind. The children were still pale and trembling, their eyes darting nervously at every shadow. But even with the town in sight, the fear that had settled over them the night before refused to loosen its grip. John parked the SUV at the edge of the town, his hands still shaking, "We're safe now," he said, trying to convince himself as much as them. Margaret hugged Emma and Tommy tightly, whispering reassurances she wasn't sure she believed. For a moment, silence fell over them, punctuated only by the soft hum of the engine and distant bird calls. It felt like safety, but deep down, John knew better. He reached into his pocket for his keys and froze. There it was, the motel key, cold, heavy, and slightly warm to the touch as if it carried its own heartbeat. He pulled it out, turning it over in his hand. It wasn't just a piece of metal. It was a tether, a reminder that whatever had been in that motel hadn't finished with them. Emma's small voice broke through his thoughts. "Dad, it's looking at us." John followed her gaze. Across the street, in the shadowed tree line just beyond the town limits, a shape lingered. It was the same hazy, twisted silhouette they had seen in the motel, the figure with hollow eyes and the grin that seemed to mock the living. Even in the daylight, it was wrong. Its edges flickered like smoke, moving subtly, impossibly, and yet it held a deliberate presence, like a predator measuring its prey. Panic welled in John's chest, but he forced calm. "Get in the car, now," he said. Margaret guided the children toward the SUV, and they climbed in without hesitation. John fumbled with the ignition. The engine sputtered, then roared to life, but as they tried to pull away, the shape moved closer, emerging from the shadows, sliding silently along the edge of the road. The air grew unnaturally cold, the kind of chill that burned lungs and made the skin crawl. Their breaths turned visible, and a thick mist began to curl around the tires. Every instinct screamed at John to flee, but the road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly. And behind them, the figure advanced. It wasn't moving like a person. It glided, its steps silent, yet somehow felt like an entire building collapsing. Emma clutched her mother's arm, whispering, "Mom, it's going to get us. I can feel it." Tommy sobbed, hiding his face against Margaret's chest. John gritted his teeth and pressed the accelerator. The SUV lurched forward, tires screeching against the asphalt. But the figure was always there at the edge of their vision, looming closer, relentless. Then came the whispers. At first, faint, almost imperceptible, like the wind rustling through leaves. But soon, they coalesced into words, indecipherable yet heavy with malice. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, pressing against their minds, burrowing into their thoughts, and stirring every fear they had ever felt. Margaret screamed, clutching her head, as the children cried louder, overwhelmed by a terror they didn't understand. Through the mist and shadows, John glimpsed the motel key glowing faintly in his hand. Almost instinctively, he understood that the key was more than a relic, it was a conduit, a link between them and the entity. He didn't fully understand how, but he knew it had to be destroyed, or else the figure would never release them. His hands shook violently as he looked around the SUV, searching for anything that could help. Suddenly, the landscape changed. The trees of the town's outskirts warped, elongating, leaning inward as if to trap them. The road beneath them rippled, darkening into black, liquid like asphalt that seemed to pulse with a heartbeat. The figure glided forward, now closer than ever, its hollow eyes fixed on them, grin widening in impossible proportions. John's stomach lurched. The road, the town, even the carol of it felt like a layer of reality that had thinned, revealing something else beneath, something hungry and patient. Margaret screamed, "Stop! Do something!" John knew what he had to do. He grabbed the key and held it tightly, focusing on the idea of breaking its hold, shattering it to sever the connection. The figure reacted instantly, twisting violently in place. A soundless roar that pressed against their ears, vibrating their skulls with sheer force. The mist thickened, and shadows from nowhere began to crawl along the SUV, clinging to the tires, the doors. pressing against the glass as though trying to prevent them from moving forward. John forced his foot down on the brake and hit the glove compartment, finding a small hammer he had packed earlier. Heart racing, he raised it and struck the key with all his strength. The sound of metal shattering rang impossibly loud in the dense air, and the moment the key broke, the figure screamed, though no sound emerged, and recoiled violently. For a brief second, everything paused. Then, the motel appeared. Not in the distance, not in the shadows, but suddenly surrounding them on all sides. The room they had stayed in stretched infinitely, the walls warped and bleeding shadow. Emma and Tommy screamed, their voices echoing unnaturally. The floorboards cracked and shifted beneath them, and from the darkness, hundreds of faint, distorted faces pressed against the walls. Mouths open in silent screams. John and Margaret held their children close, moving through the warped motel corridors. Each step was a battle, the shadowy air resisting them, whispering lies and horrors from their deepest fears. The glow of the key fragments in John's hand seemed to guide them, pulsing gently like a heartbeat, a faint thread of hope through the madness. Finally, they saw the exited doorway to the highway, normal and solid, light spilling through. But as they approached, the figure lunged, stretching impossibly, its grin wider, more grotesque. John threw the key fragments at it. The pieces hit the shadow with a metallic clang, and it shrieked, dissolving into mist and smoke, leaving the family trembling but free. They stumbled into the SUV and drove, hearts pounding, adrenaline surging. The sun was fully risen now, and the highway appeared normal. No motel, no shadows, no twisting reality, just empty road and the distant town they had passed earlier. Emma and Tommy clung to their parents, still shaking, while Margaret whispered prayers under her breath. John glanced at the fragments of the key in his hand, now dull and cold. He understood that the ordeal wasn't truly over. Whatever that figure was, whatever lurked behind the motel, it was patient. It waited for fear, thrived on it, and though they had escaped, the key's remnants reminded them of its persistence. The world seemed normal, but a thin, lingering dread wrapped around them like a shadow, always at the edge of perception. As they drove on, Emma broke the silence. "Dad, it's still there. I can see it." John's stomach tightened. He looked toward the tree line they had passed and, just for a heartbeat, thought he saw a thin, dark shape watching them from between the trees. His hand tightened on the steering wheel. They had survived the night, but the sense of being hunted lingered, a cold truth pressing against their chest. Fear had found a permanent home with them. The family didn't speak for miles, even when they reached the
Please like and subscribe channel Fear Frequency for more horror stories. Thank you.